So I would go a step further in terms of how totemic I think this by-election is. Not just will it decide likely the next Prime Minister, but actually the entire contours of electoral competition.
Yep.
So what you're getting is Burnham's personality versus the gravitational pull of the seat to reform.
And I think this is why, if he were to win this, I mean, you've heard there have been quotes over the weekend of people saying, he'd be literally carried high through the streets of Westminster by Labour MPs. Hello and welcome to Coffee House. I'm Tim Shipman, the political editor of The Spectator, and my usual sidekick, Mr. James Heal, is not with us this week, so I am delighted to be joined by Luke Tryl of More in Common, one of Britain's leading pollsters, one of the best focus groupers in the business, the man who has his finger on the pulse of the British voter, and nowhere more so than in those red wall seats that he has chronicled extensively over the last few years. And that is now key, of course, because there's only one subject on everybody's minds, and that is the Makerfield by-election coming up in mid-June, which is going to decide not just who the MP for Makerfield is, but very likely who the next Prime Minister is as well. So, Luke, delighted to have you with us.
Great to be here.
So, look, this is probably the most sort of bizarre and exciting by-election we've ever had in British political history. And we journalists are giving to hyperbole, but I can't think of an occasion where we've had one that's literally going to decide who runs the country in quite this way. What are you hearing from the ground? Have you done any straight constituency polling yet? And just talk us through what you're seeing from all the pollsters. Where does this contest lie at the moment?
So I would go a step further in terms of how totemic I think this by-election is. Not just will it decide likely the next Prime Minister, but actually the entire contours of electoral competition in the run-up to the next election. And that's because if you look at Makerfield, on almost every level, it is a seat tailor-made for reform to gain, heavily leave voting, slightly older than average, fewer graduates there. One of those areas which become known as sort of left behind, and in fact, actually, Josh Simon's, I think, very good letter makes the point about towns around the north of England that have been left behind. So, on the one hand, you've got that, and so if it were anyone...
Predominantly white as well, I
predominantly
think,
white,
yeah, 97%. Sort of classic white working class kind of seat, basically.
Exactly that. So, if you were to ask me, kind of straight off, in the absence of Andy Burnham, that this is an easy reform pickup, and if reform aren't picking it up, actually, they'd be in trouble. On the other hand, and I've spent a lot of time in Greater Manchester, in different parts, because it's quite interesting, Greater Manchester. You've got kind of leafy Altrincham, you've got the centre, which is much more studenty, you've got Gorton and Denton, and then you've got places like Wigan, with Lee and Haywood and Middleton, those other seats which are much more red walling. And the truth is the Burnham factor is real, right? Talk to people in focus groups in the area and they can point to things he's done, particularly around transport, but also this idea of him as a champion against Westminster. And people bring up, I still remember it, but people bring up, when he was on his phone during COVID and he finds out about the tears and, it's become a kind of iconic image for him. And so what you're getting is Burnham's personality versus the gravitational pull of the seat to reform. We think that Burnham, if you use his mayoral contest, Burnham's overperformance is around 20 points.
Oh, really? It's that big?
And if you then model that onto the seat, you get Burnham just narrowly ahead. That's also similar. I know Salvation have done some modelling as well, based on some of their polling. They also have Burnham just ahead there. But, coin toss is probably the right
That's where
phrase.
it is, basically. And I think you believe that had Burnham run in Gorton and Denton, he probably would have just got over the line there as well. That seems contested still, but certainly most Burnham loyalists think that he had enough of that personal vote. Because in constituencies, normally, a personal vote is, a couple of thousand votes. It doesn't amount to 20 points is a heck of a thing. And what does that point to? I think it points to still that sense of... This is obviously a metropolitan area in a profound sense, but if you think of London as the metropolis, it's us and them and all of that. And it's people pushing against sort of liberal progressive London. So on the one hand, Andy Burnham wants to come south to take on the Labour leadership and effectively will need the votes of progressive London. But right now, he needs the votes of red wall old Labour, essentially. And that is going to be the sort of the conflict here in the messaging and in how he presents himself. And, imagine the role for those people knocking on doors. You've knocked on doors for candidates before. Can you imagine knocking on a door saying, what I really need you to vote for this bloke from my party because I want him to go south and kick out the leader of my party. So you're relying on a kind of anti-Starmer position as well. It's going to be very awks for the. I guess Manchester Labour will lead on it, and you won't see, beyond a few ministers who'd quite like to see Keir Starmer go. You're going to see those kind of London people going and knocking on doors and saying, "Come on, we need this lad," and he's one of yours. Yeah. Send him down to sort us out. That's going to be the message, essentially. How's this going to play then? So Reform are obviously the main challengers, but there's some interesting other blocks of votes there, aren't there? So there's a bit of a Green vote, which I can see voting Labour to turn the Labour Party more left-wing. There's Tory votes. I think there were 4,000 Tory votes at the last general election. What are they going to do? Have they evaporated, as the local elections say, they've gone already? Have they already decided where they're going? Or I could see people voting tactically to vote for Burnham, to keep Reform away from a seat. I can see people voting for Reform to cause as much chaos as possible in the Labour Party. Though I think the most chaos would be Burnham losing. Ironically, we can come to that in a moment. But tactical voting, which is more significant, do you think? The sort of stop Reform or the stop Burnham carpetbagger kind of argument that you'll get from some people?
Well, certainly in Gorton and Denton, stop Reform was by far the biggest driver. And in part, that was the candidate that Reform chose to pick in Gorton and Denton, had a long track record, made some comments which lots of people consider quite inflammatory. And people in the focus groups in Gorton would say, I want to stop Matt Goodwin. And I think Reform are going to try and pick a different style of candidate.
I mean, the indications are they'll probably go with the same guy who's a local small businessman who's, kind of salt of the earth kind of character. Those people can be dangerous in a very high-profile by-election. If they're not that experienced, they can say the wrong things and things can get blown up. But I would have thought if you're basically relying on Nigel Farage to be there most days, marching around, this is my guy, he's one of you, unlike this bloke from down the road, that will be part of their argument.
Definitely. So I think it's going to be much more Sarah Potchin than Matt Goodwin, right, in this. But then you get into all of these interesting dynamics. So, the Greens have said, I think, that they're running a candidate for sure now. There's around 10% of the vote, which was Green. Does that get squeezed massively? And, actually, if Burnham wins having also squeezed the Green vote, he's basically taken on Labour's twin dragons. Right?
And that's an argument he wants to take south. I mean, I think this is why, if he were to win this, I mean, you've heard, there have been quotes over the weekend of people saying, he'd be literally carried high through the streets of Westminster by Labour MPs because he would have shown himself able to beat both of those sort of, as you say, the twin dragons, the people who are stealing all those Labour votes at the moment. But a big problem has come up over the weekend. And part of me quite admires Wes Streeting for what can only be described as running interference, I think is the polite way of putting it. I have no doubt at all that Wes Streeting wants to rejoin the European Union, but make that his first big pitch, having not quite launched a leadership contest, and effectively daring Andy Burnham to repeat what he said last autumn, which is that eventually he would like to rejoin the European Union. That is potentially the most sort of toxic thing. And the Burnham people are furious about this. They sort of said, Wes Streeting's done this on purpose and now we have to talk about this in a very Leave seat. And that's going to be a problem. I don't think we yet know, what does this mean? Andy Burnham's basically said, well, I do want to rejoin the European Union, but I don't want to talk about this in this... Well, I bet you don't. But I guess, to be fair to Andy Burnham, we don't yet know, would he plan to put it in the next Labour manifesto? Would he campaign on it? On what terms would he be prepared to rejoin? Because a lot of very sensible people on the left of British politics understand that rejoining the European Union would be quite problematic. We're in the midst of talks at the moment. There's supposed to be a summit in June or July to agree all the stuff that we were campaigning to improve with the EU last year. That hasn't happened yet. And then there's another round of talks which looks even more problematic. And if we were getting into rejoining, does that include the euro? Does it include rejoining the Schengen zone? All of that kind of stuff. I think this is the last thing that Burnham needs. But it's odd that his team didn't seem to have a better kind of answer lined up, because even if Wes Streeting had not put this straight on the agenda, you can pretty sure Nigel Farage would have gone back and looked at those comments. But how impactful might that be? I mean, you've done a lot of work on Brexit, maybe not necessarily in this seat, but what are people thinking about that now?
So, and this is it. This is why I think people are slightly tying themselves in knots, because Brexit, as you know, better than anyone else, it has never just been about Brexit, right? It's been a sort of symbol for the type of country that people think we had and who it works for and where we want to be in the future. So to start off with salience, Brexit, pretty low salience. Never comes up, basically, in focus groups, apart from some people say we never got that 350 million from the NHS, contested, obviously, but that's the only way in which it comes up. Secondly, people tend to say, in fact, don't quite overwhelmingly say it hasn't worked, but they split on could it never have worked or did politicians stuff it up? And actually a plurality say it was politicians that stuffed it up. So you've then got that. You've then got the third issue, which is, so we don't ask people in our tracker about rejoin because I think it's a, as you exactly said.
We don't know what it is yet, essentially.
So we ask people about how they would vote during, if the referendum was rerun, because we think that's a more honest question.
Yep.
And there has been a shift, both some regret, but also the bigger thing is new entrants to the electorate.
Yep.
And all things being equal, it looks now like, there'll be a reasonably comfortable, but this isn't during a campaign, but just, all things being equal, reasonably comfortable Remain vote. We then, if we project that onto somewhere like Makerfield, taking account of the demographics, think it would be potentially actually narrowly, Remain now. But that is in the absence of a campaign, and it ignores the fact that what Brexit is code for, what it says to lots of people is it's about priorities. And I think the danger for Labour is less about this becomes a debate about relationship with the European Union and more a sense of, oh my goodness, have these guys not learned anything we've been trying to say to them for the past 10 years? Is it going to go back to this London-centric model? Places like Makerfield end up being forgotten. And I think that's a risk. And then the final thing I would say on that is that even if, even as Brexit is low salience, might not matter, people don't think it works, immigration really does. And if I were Andy Burnham, my worry would be the next question after being asked about Brexit would be, what are you going to do about Shabana Mahmood's immigration reforms?
Yeah.
We know that, we think he's been sort of critical of some aspects of that in the past. If he is seen to move on that, because Makerfield is one of the constituencies that cares most about immigration in the country, that I think would be much more dangerous than the Brexit.
Yeah, and what the Leave campaign did very successfully, certainly the Farage side of it, and during the campaign, the Dominic Cummings, Boris Johnson side of it, was to effectively tie migration and Brexit together. Farage said, this is, we have freedom of movement, this is why we have high migration. Of course, that argument in essence doesn't work in quite the way it used to, because who put up net migration more than anybody else? It was Boris Johnson when he was Prime Minister, with Priti Patel as his Home Secretary. So the Boris wave has done some damage to that argument, but that's not an excuse for a lot of these voters, I don't think. I think their view is that migration is still a problem, and Brexit might have low salience, but I don't know about Makerfield, but correct me if I'm wrong, pretty well everyone has cost of living at the top, and quite a lot of people have migration either at the top with it or just behind it, essentially. And there are other issues that matter in British politics, but those two are far and away the most salient and significant. So Burnham has now got a decision to make about how far he leans into this. Now, I know people on the right of the Labour Party who think if Andy Burnham can go through the fire of Makerfield and emerge recognising that controlling migration is not a bad thing and that Shabana Mahmood's policies are supported by 7 out of 10 Labour voters nationally and even half of Green voters nationally, that might actually make him a rather better candidate to be the Prime Minister. It might make him a slightly less emphatic candidate to be the Labour leader, but the likelihood is, if he's shown that he can beat the Greens and beat Reform, that won't matter, because Wes Streeting is not going to beat him in those circumstances. And Keir Starmer, all indications are over the weekend that Starmer, in that situation, would face the music and understand that he needed at some point to step aside. So, but it's very difficult to see how he squares that circle in campaign rhetoric when Reform are just putting out attack videos already now, and Farage is calling Burnham Mr. Open Borders. And the problem for Burnham over the years is that he's been he's a character who has tended to move with the prevailing winds. There's an old Labour joke about a Blairite, a Brownite and a Corbynite walk into a bar and the barman says, "Hello, Andy." And you sort of wonder which Burnham is going to stand up. Yeah. It seems to me that Burnham now has to decide which Burnham he's going to be in this campaign, but actually the campaign could shape him a bit as well and actually make him perhaps a more palatable candidate to some people who've left the Labour Party than beforehand. What do we know about his rivals, though? Because let's wargame this out. If Burnham wins the by-election, which as we all agree, basically at the moment is a coin flip. Though that could change if one of these campaigns kind of gathers pace on something he said or something he now says. But if that doesn't happen, it looks pretty chaotic. Where do you think the public are in terms of definitely wanting Starmer to go, firstly, and if the assumption of the cabinet and everybody else is that Starmer's going but Burnham's not available, where does that leave Ed Miliband, Angela Rayner, and Wes Streeting, who I think everyone agrees that's, Al Khan's can do all the social media he wants, but I don't think anyone really thinks he's...
Nice sunrises.
Some beautiful sunrises and the odd sunset as well. But where are they? There's already a movement in Labour saying we need a woman, because they always say that, though they seem always to never quite elect one. We saw George Osborne over the weekend winding up his mate Ed Balls saying, what about this Yvette Cooper woman? She's rather good. Why don't we have her? Who's, of course, Mrs. Ed Balls. Angela Rayner, my strong impression from talking to the people around her and people who know her well is that she's prepared to defer to Burnham. I'm not sure whether she's prepared to defer to Ed Miliband. Ed Miliband seems to have decided that Andy Burnham should be the leader, but if he's not, he needs to step in to prevent Angela Rayner being the candidate. And obviously Wes Streeting on the right of the party is hoping for as much chaos as possible. So he can say, well, look, I'm the answer here. I'm with you guys on Brexit, but I'm a bit more less likely to sort of blow up the economy than some of these people on the left and all. What are the head-to-heads looking like within the party, and is there a sort of strong feeling in the public that could have a sway on these things? Because the Labour Party membership can be more pragmatic than the MPs in terms of wanting to win elections. Just tell us what you're finding.
Absolutely.
With everybody
just
else.
Before I do, I just wonder, just on the neutralise the question for Burnham, because you've now got to give some kind of answer on this EU question. And if I were him, what I would do is, because you can't, there's just no way you can do it in this Parliament anyway, right? It wasn't manifest, you'd need some... I think he needs to, and I know others have suggested similar, some version of the Gordon Brown 5 tests, where he says, we will look to rejoin if these things are met. And he must make one of those, will it benefit places like Makerfield? And if it doesn't, I won't. If it does, I will. And you front that up. You said the previous arrangement benefited the South and London. This is what we do. So...
And if you look at what they've renegotiated, what have we got? We've paid a large sum of money to go back into, student travel, which may or may not be relevant to the high school kids of Makerfield. It's all, it's sort of posh London families who want to send their kids to France for a year, who are going to benefit from that primarily. Are we, there was talk of fighting our way through the passport queues and not having to do that. That seemed to take a long time, not least because a lot of the individual countries have the right to say one thing or another. So the proof of what we're already actually doing with the EU already looks quite southeast focused. It's not about industrial, recreation in Manchester or Birmingham or, the more discarded places of the northeast. That's not what it feels like at the moment.
No, absolutely. But the one thing I would say that is actually the e-gate passport thing drives everyone mad.
Oh, totally.
That is the
solve that.
big thing. Yeah, that's the big thing. But look, so the head-to-head. So look, Burnham is much more popular than Keir Starmer with the public. He comes out 16 points ahead in our tracking. But interestingly,
and that's a sort of approved, not approved.
That's who would you prefer? Would you prefer as PM? Now, there's a big chunk of don't knows in the middle. But Burnham 16 points ahead. When you ask about Starmer versus Streeting, Starmer is actually 5 points ahead.
And this is with the public?
This is with the public, yeah. But again, huge chunk of unknowns then. Actually, nearly 50% say that they don't know. Starmer versus Miliband, Starmer is up 11. So, he is much higher there.
Because in the party, Ed Miliband is the most popular cabinet minister, a guy with an agenda who has an ability to drive that agenda. The people on the left think, well, if he's not going to be the leader, he might be a respectable Chancellor of the Exchequer. But the public remembers Ed Miliband, or those that do at least remember a lot of intellectual chat, not much grit, and bluntly, they remember a bloke with 2 kitchens who couldn't eat a bacon sandwich properly. He's not got that sort of national warmth that the Labour Party feels for him.
But also the reinvention of Ed Miliband into, a person who, whether you like his agenda or not, delivers on it and does definitely seem more ease with himself. That hasn't cut through to the public just because it's not a public-facing...
That's a very SW1 kind of focused thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then Rayner, if you look at Starmer versus Rayner, Starmer's up 12 there. So, actually, Burnham is currently the only one who is ahead with the public. When you look at them, we haven't done membership polling, but again, Labour List and Survation, I think, have done some. And there they find that Burnham ahead of Starmer. Rayner and Miliband, I think, remember, just ahead of Starmer as well. Streeting again.
Would lose to
behind,
Starmer in a straight
would
fight.
lose. And that's just members, that's not the affiliates that they're because obviously trade union members.
Yeah, and you detect that the trade unions are in a state of pretty much open revolt at the moment. They've had enough of Starmer. They don't think he's delivering the agenda they want. Though I don't think most of them would regard would regard Wes Streeting as being the kind of person who would deliver the agenda they want either. But I don't know what this tells us, really. It tells us that people can go in, assuming Burnham doesn't win the by-election, this could be pretty chaotic. I mean, I did some numbers at the end of last week, and I think, the percentages could change a little bit, but I had Burnham on, nearly half, and then Miliband on slightly more than half of the rest of it, and I had Starmer and Rayner at roughly the same kind of level, about 10% each, because I don't think Angela Rayner wants to fight Burnham, and I think Miliband would try and stop her fighting him. That may be that's wrong, and that, as these things evolve, Rayner could emerge again. I think the view amongst MPs is that she sent a lot of mixed messages for a long time about whether she wants the job or thinks she's up to it. And again, similar mixed messages from the people around her. But that push to have a woman, the Tories have had a lot of women, they've had a lot of non-white leaders, and that's embarrassing for the Labour Party, bluntly, isn't it? What would happen if you bring in some of the other sort of what are perceived as a safe pair of hands? Let's talk about Yvette Cooper. I mean, I don't know whether she's better known than any of these. I mean, her reputation in Whitehall is of someone who's quite cautious. Shabana Mahmood was sent to the Home Office to sort of sort things out because she didn't really want to kind of really get to grips with it. Her reputation as a minister in the previous Labour government was as someone who didn't make decisions particularly precipitately. So would she, is there name recognition there? Is there a sort of safe pair of hands argument that people could advance if they wanted to?
Well, I guess it's there. I mean, she definitely does have more name recognition. The public do like to be reassured. But then, given the public, one thing we should have said is despite Starmer being ahead on those metrics, the public overwhelmingly think he should, resign. As sort of 2-1. Even Labour 2024 voters are split on the question now, which is the most damning. So what question are you answering with Yvette Cooper or John Healey? And I thought Josh Simons was really interesting because he made the point when he was doing Media Round yesterday that politicians have become scared of taking risks, right? And that actually, he was making it from a sort of ideological point of view. From a public point of view, I can see that as well. Like, people blame polling and focus groups, right? They go, the problem with polling and focus groups is that, people just blindly follow them. No. What polling and focus groups should show you is that people want an argument to be made. Yes. They want you to go out there. They want you to advocate.
They want to be led.
They want to be
bluntly.
They want to be led. Like, just do it in a sensible way. And, people... I was writing something about this. The thing that drives me mad is people talk about winter fuel as if it shows that the British public, can't deal with any trade-offs. No, winter fuel was announced in the middle of nowhere, outside a budget, with a threshold that was too low, wasn't in a manifesto, no pitch rolling. It was just bad comms and bad.
It was a perfectly reasonable argument you could build,
but it
which was effectively it's wrong for all these rich people to be getting all this money, and we can save some money and give it to people who need it more. I mean, proper Labour argument. Same with the welfare reforms. You say all these people are on the scrap heap. This is a disgrace. We're failing them as people, and we're losing an economic gain as human capital is being wasted here. But it was all dressed up as cuts and savings, and I agree that's partly a comms problem. But I think most of the time, comms problem. I mean, you've done comms. Most of the time, you were on thin ice doing comms was because the policy was rubbish.
Totally. And that policy, but it was that 12 grand threshold. You had people just above it who would say, "Well, I've worked all my life and I'm not getting it. X down the road hasn't." It was just on every level. It was just a bad policy. And actually, I think if Labour are going to go through this process of changing leader, they need to think about what is the question we are trying to answer. And actually, it comes back to the front of the Labour manifesto: change. Right, and need to have some radicalism. So maybe a sort of Yvette Cooper calms things, but I just don't think, if the public are in revolt against the status quo, I just don't see how Yvette Cooper's the answer there.
No, I think, that's interesting. Before we go, let's just talk a little bit about the right, because this is sort of exhuming the innards of the Labour Party. Has anything changed since the local elections? So in the local elections, the Conservative Party were very good at saying, we've made some progress, we've not lost places we expected to lose, Kemi Badenoch, I think by everybody's agreement in SW1 at least, has raised her game, has performed better. She made a good argument the other day on the streets against someone over anti-Semitism, which a lot of people thought was pretty impressive. But there's a counter-narrative to that, which is beginning to gather pace, that actually the performance was worse than a year ago. There's no real way back. The Tories are fooling themselves if they think that they've turned the corner. Is there any movement in the numbers since then, or what's your take on that sort of broad argument?
I mean, I think we sort of are where we were before, really, which is Kemi Badenoch has cut through, and actually beyond SW1. If you look at the approval ratings now, on some of our polls, her approvals are as high as Farage's, so it's not just lack of name recognition, and she has lower negatives, right? People say, I like the fact that she tells it like it is. She's now got some celebrity backers over the weekend.
Yes, Nicki Minaj has come out, and another rapper whose work is as yet unknown to me.
But she's clearly got something. But the problem is the brand, right?
Yeah.
People still just, people saying, what is the point of voting Conservative? And we're going to have Makerfield where they get, squeezed. I could see them being beaten by Restore. We haven't even touched on.
That was my next question.
But there is a contest, another by-election, which will tell us a lot more about the Conservative Party's fortunes, and that's Aberdeen South.
Yes.
Where in the general election they came a reasonable, quite close second to the SNP.
Yep.
Reform for that. They also performed well in that area during the Scottish Parliament elections.
Yep.
That will be an area where the Conservatives will not be able to do that. We were never on the pitch here.
They can't hide.
They cannot hide. So that,
and what they need to do there is unite the Unionist vote, essentially, to defeat the SNP. But the reform will be an issue for them there.
No, totally. And there was a whole series of seats across Scotland. So Eastwood was one of them, a couple of the other Aberdeenshire ones, where actually it wasn't just a split in the Unionist vote, it was a split on the right of the Unionist vote that let the SNP through. You're talking hundreds of votes in places like Eastwood. The Tories would have held it. So can they make an argument to Reform voters that it's a wasted vote? So far, Reform have proven notoriously difficult to squeeze.
Yes.
And so that, to me, I'm looking at that as a big test. I still
because if you've got around to voting Reform, the chances are you've had it with all the others.
Completely. And you're like, well, what is the point? So that, to me, is the biggest test actually that Kemi Badenoch faces. Can they? I think it's probably a hard ask to win it from the SNP, but can they keep a close second?
Yeah.
And if they can, maybe the argument is starting to trickle through.
And in terms of the Tory brand, has there been any drop-off since the general election? Is that beginning to peel down or not? Because I remember one of the sort of veteran Tory advisors, David Canzini, saying it takes 2 years before anyone's even prepared to give you a hearing. If Kemi Badenoch can maintain that personal popularity, could you expect the Tory brand to gradually improve? Are the negatives dropping off or not? Or is that still absolutely rock solid in the way that it was in July of 2024?
So I think the encouraging thing for the Tories is that they're definitely less hated.
Yeah.
And we, as well as running a vote for tracker, we run a vote against tracker. I'm actually about to put out the latest version of ours now. And people are much more likely to say they would vote against Labour, Reform, and to some degree the Greens. And then you have the Tories and Lib Dems much further back. Now, on the one hand, that is good because you've kind of detoxified a bit. There was some evidence of actually left-wing parties voting tactically for the Tories in these local elections. On the other hand, is it just because you're irrelevant, right? People don't like you because they're there. So I think, bluntly, part of the challenge is, I've been really struck by, if you look at the Sunday round, has it ever been the leader of the opposition as much as it is Kemi Badenoch out there? And is that because the criticism which voters often give me about Farage and Reform is it a one-man band?
Yeah.
Is it a one-woman band? And I think until she has other people going out and making the argument as well, it's difficult to move the brand forward. Yeah.
No, I think that's an interesting observation. Let's talk about Restore. Rupert Lowe has basically said they're going to run in Makerfield. I don't know what their level of support, whether there's any way of gauging what their level of support might be at this point, but I think the simple thing to say is even if they got a couple of percent, that could have a pretty massive effect on the chances of Reform beating Burnham, essentially.
Absolutely. And so what do we know about Restore? We know that their sort of sister party, Great Yarmouth First, dominated in Great Yarmouth, but that is Rupert Lowe's constituency. I think, if you look across the polls, they're probably somewhere around 2-3%. People who tend to be more engaged, quite online, tend to tend to back them there. We do get people who bring them up in focus groups occasionally, clearly not as much as the others. So there is something there. I am genuinely interested in how real that is and how willing Restore voters are to play the spoiler in somewhere like Makerfield, because you do get some people saying they're the real thing. And I was looking at, actually, I think it was someone from Politics Joe, actually, who was on the Unite the Kingdom march and saying that many of the people there said, no, Farage is part of the establishment, Rupert Lowe is the real one. But again, that's a group of very engaged people. But can you imagine a world in which Andy Burnham wins and the margin over reform is the Restore vote? We're going to be in total, again, another element of chaos.
Well, yeah, we've talked about the Labour Party melting down, but the meltdown on the right could be.
And then what do Reform do? Do they go and chase Lowe on the right?
Yeah.
But then actually, what I call Reform's second 15%, the group who would get them to a majority, they don't want a load of that either. So, it's bizarre. With political cycles being able, suddenly then Reform are in a pincer movement.
Yeah, and then actually at that point, I mean, a lot of Tories would say that if Reform starts moving right, that would open the door a little bit for them. So I'm not sure what we've decided today, Luke. We haven't told you who's going to win the by-election. We haven't told you who's going to win the Labour leadership. We haven't told you who's going to be the Prime Minister. But we can promise you emphatically 100% that whatever follows will be utter chaos. Thank you to Luke Tryl, and thank you to all of you for joining us today.